Good morning, everyone. I am Maddie Gustafson, and I'm a project coordinator at NEHA, and I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar in the four-part Data and Environmental Health Best Practices webinar series. Just a few Zoom reminders before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them to the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Any other inquiries, please send them through the chat feature. To get started, I would like to introduce Sarah Schott, and she will be moderating for this session and lead our Q&A after the presentation.
My name is Sarah Schott, and I'm a data standards consultant to NEHA. For the last year or so, we've been working on a project to open up aquatic facility inspection information in a standard format. And in that process, we have been studying the nature of how environmental health agencies are making their information open, or challenges that exist for them in making that information more accessible to themselves, to their stakeholders, and to their communities. Today, we're bringing in Waldo Jaquith as part of our second webinar in this series on open data to explain to us how to really facilitate open data from the very start in the systems that we use. So I'm excited to have Waldo here. I've known him for a number of years. He is very much an expert in the field, so respected, done a ton of innovative work and a lot of research. He's now at the Beck Center, and I'm going to hand it over to Waldo. Waldo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Let me bring up my slides here. I'm going to talk to you today about the need to own your data, why it's wicked important that the data that you are storing in systems actually be yours to, as the subtitle says, to avoid vendor lock-in through open data and better software. Here's what I'm going to tell you. The theme of this is that your data is an artifact of your software. So there's this really substantial degree to which your agency or your department is your data. So your software is enormously important. The context I want to give you for this is your knowledge, environmental health knowledge, is really rare. There are not a lot of people who know what you know, but there are over 2 million programmers in the United States. So the stuff that like my people know, as I am a software developer, is ubiquitous. And what you know is actually pretty uncommon. So to the extent to which you're thinking of software as some mysterious art to be practiced by wizards, I discourage that. What you do is much more rare and valuable. So just keep that in mind while I'm talking to you. Just to enumerate what's on the screen, number one, I want to tell you about why you need to own your own data. Number two, I want to talk to you about how you can evaluate commercial software to know if it's going to allow you to own your data. And then number three, how and why to build your own software, which might sound like an unrelated leap, but hear me out. These are related. Who am I? I am Waldo Jaquith. I work for the Beck Center at Georgetown University. Jumping back a decade, I was with the Office of Science Technology Policy under the Obama White House. I then worked in the nonprofit space, running an organization called US Open Data. And then I just finished up 4 years with 18F, which is the federal government's technology shop, working heavily in procurement, teaching government at local, state, and federal level how to better procure software so that they don't spend a fortune and get nothing to show for it, which is the norm. As the slide explains, the Beck Center is this experiential hub at Georgetown to equip future global leaders on outcomes-driven solutions and incubates ideas for social change. The idea is to work across sectors to generate new ideas, to provoke leaders to think and act differently. The part of the Beck Center that I'm within is this data and digital silo, which promotes our work as improving livelihoods by better government service delivery and responsible data use. So that's me. That's the Beck Center. The part of the Beck Center that I work with is the State Software Collaborative, teaching states how to work together on software, or even governments within states on how to work together to collaboratively build and procure software instead of wasting your money by everybody spending same dollars on the same things over and over again. Better to pool that for some public benefits. Enough of that. Let's get to the thesis. The number one of the three things we're going over here is own your data. And here's why. If you don't own your data, then your vendor owns your data, and you're stuck with them forever. So this is not a small point. Consider it in these terms. What's going to exist longer, your agency or your vendor? That's the basic calculus. If you think your vendor is going to outlive your agency or your government, well, then I guess it doesn't matter. But realistically, you're going to be around a lot longer than them. So you need to have a plan as to what you're going to do when they disappear one day. So there are two ways in which you need to own your own data, legally and practically. So let's address both of those. The first is you have to own your data in a legal sense by including a data rights clause in the contract. This is not a real complicated thing. Data rights contract just says that the agency or department, whatever is appropriate for you, the agency intends that all data produced by the contractor will be owned by the agency. This includes, but is not limited to, documents, reports, schemas, metadata, and the like. Something very much like this is what you want to have. You might amend it to say stored by the contractor, received, accepted, whatever. You can work with your lawyers on it. But the idea is that's got to be somewhere in your contract that you have with vendors. And here's why. My favorite / most horrible story about this is with the state of Georgia. Georgia has had LexisNexis for many years as the company that codifies their laws. So you may not know this because there's not cause for most people to know this, but legislatures, after they pass bills, somebody has to have the job of updating the laws to reflect what the bills say need to be changed. And often this is outsourced. So Georgia has outsourced this to LexisNexis for many years, who codifies, as it's known, their laws, and then produces that in books and CD-ROMs and so on for copies of the laws. So Georgia, for some years, didn't have what's called a catch line. They didn't have like names for their laws. It would just be section 12.34 instead of, burglary generally, or murder in the second degree, or whatever it might be called. And LexisNexis, just out of the goodness of their heart, some years ago went to Georgia and said, if you want, we could write titles for all of your laws. And Georgia said, no, we're not going to pay for that. And LexisNexis said, no, we're just going to do, we want to charge you for it. We're just going to do it. And Georgia said, well, gosh, okay, that sounds good. Sure, go for it. So they did so. It was a big project. And for years, they printed copies of the Georgia Code, including these, until it became normal to refer to laws by their LexisNexis assigned names and not 12-34. This was okay until it wasn't. Somebody wanted permission to reproduce the laws of Georgia and was told that they could not, because intermingled with what is obviously public domain, the contents of the laws, were the titles that LexisNexis had come up with, that they owned, and said, oh no, you can't reproduce the laws with those intact. And by the way, the only way that we'll give you copies of the laws, you have to buy them on book or CD-ROM, includes those titles. So the effect of it was to poison the well. There was no way to get or reproduce the Code of Georgia without extremely extensive work to remove those titles. But even then, there were cross-references to other laws that in turn used those names. So in a practical sense, LexisNexis now owned the laws of Georgia. So this went clear up to the Supreme Court in Georgia v. public.resource.org in the spring, who ruled against Georgia. In fact, you can reproduce the laws, but it was a heck of a ride to get there. That took years and years to get that outcome. The reason I tell you this story is this. It's not enough to believe that you own something. The contract must say in no uncertain terms, in the most sweeping available language, that the work that you produce and put in software, the work that your vendors do for you, is owned by you. It is owned by the people. It is in the public, because otherwise, even the entire state of Georgia can get screwed over by getting that wrong. I would like to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. So there's the legal sense. You have to own your data practically by ensuring that you can get the data out of the software at any time. It's one thing to say, for a vendor to say, oh, you own your data, but it's another to actually have the ability to get it out. These are different things entirely. And not just to get it out at all, but in a machine readable way, as it's known. So if you said, hey, we're going with a different vendor and we need our data out, and the contract said you could get it, perhaps the vendor could comply by giving you a big stack of paper in the mail where they've printed out all of the data you've ever put into the system. Does that comply with the contract? Maybe. If you didn't specify it's got to be machine readable, maybe. So that's the difference between the legal and the practical sense. You want to be able to get your data in a file format that other software can use. So not a bunch of PDFs, but if you want to switch to keeping your data in a different vendor system, it's got to be in some sort of a common format like XML, CSV, JSON. One of these acronyms are all different ways to do this. And the idea, by the way, of getting your data back in a big printout is not specious. Like, that happens, particularly in journalists' world, where they FOIA data from agencies that are reluctant to release it. And so the agencies will take, say, a spreadsheet, they'll just print out the spreadsheet over hundreds of pages and give it to the journalist, knowing that, of course, it will not allow them to do what they wanted to do with it, because they're not getting machine readable data, that they're getting a printout. So you got to own your data practically as well. There's an insurance policy here available to you. Open data. Georgia learned this the hard way. If other people can get your data, then you can get your data. So this is known as open data, the practice of government agencies, when they house data, making all data that's appropriate to make public, making that public, and making it public preemptively, not waiting for a FOIA request, but allowing people to get it at any time. The reason this is important is because if you can't extract your data in machine readable format, then your data is effectively held hostage. And one way to make sure that you can is using that phrase open data, which vendors understand what it means and they know what goes into it. There is no equivalent phrase for, hey, we need to be able to get our data out if at some point we want to leave you as our vendor. It's like a prenup, basically, within your contract. That's often sticky to discuss with vendors, still important. But to say, we need a system with open data, and put that right in an RFP, it makes very clear what you're going for. An important note about this, by the way, is like a bunch of the data that you have is personally identifying information that shouldn't actually be open data. So it's important that the data be stored in such a way that that's separated out from the start. That's on the vendors to do, it's not on you. But let's be clear that open data doesn't mean taking private data and making it public. But ultimately, this is about an easy way to ensure that you can't be trapped by vendors in your data being locked in their systems in a way that you can't get out in a practical sense, even if you can get it out in a legal sense. Let's move on to my second thesis here about the importance of critically evaluating commercial software. So there are plenty of vendors who will sell you the various types of software you need to manage your data. And most of you here use such software. Some of you might be happy with that software. Others might have reservations. Some of y'all might hate your software. That's the normal range of things. And that's why it's important to do serious research before selecting a vendor. So let's just review some basic points here about how to evaluate your options. Don't rely on a sales pitch or a proposal. If you publish an RFP and you get back a proposal, I get bad news about relying on that. It's a cliche within big software companies that the sales teams will sell technology, and then it's on the tech staff to figure out how to actually follow through that promise, whether or not it's even possible. They get pinched by that. What is promised in a proposal or a sales pitch may or may not be acted upon. And if you're thinking, well, geez, isn't that in the contract? Yeah, but unless you're going to sue them over it, probably doesn't matter. So can't rely on that. What can you rely on? Well, you can talk to other customers. Folks like the other people attending this talk, your colleagues, find out how they feel. How did that vendor work for them? Do they have a vendor that they liked more? What is it they like about it? If it works well for them, is it going to work well for you? You got to talk about this. And that might sound obvious, but it is appallingly normal to not talk about it. I have worked with multiple states, particularly with MMIS's, Medicare Management Information Systems. These systems that are priced out in increments of hundreds of millions of dollars. And routinely, states will sign contracts with vendors to procure one of these without ever talking to any other state who procured them, because if they had, they would have run screaming, because all of the claimed success stories from these vendors are actually ended in lawsuits. So talk to other customers, find out how they feel. The third, never pay for modifications to commercial software. That is the equivalent of renting a house and then paying to build a new wing on that rental house. You are paying for something you don't own. That's even assuming that they can make those modifications. Again, we're right back to the sales staff promising things that may not be carried through technologically. But you don't own it, don't pay to have it modified, it's just throwing away money. And don't buy commercial software on the promise of future features. Again, you'll be promised all kinds of things in order to get your business. Whether or not they ever add those features remains to be seen, and just try to get them put it in the contract. I think you'll see there's some reluctance there, and they might have an explanation why, but it's because they know that they can't really promise that. So you shouldn't tie yourself to it. I want to point out here that software as a service is commercial software too. So that's where it's something you access through a web browser that is hosted by the vendor, like Google Docs, for instance. You can't buy Google Docs. You can't install it on your local system. You can't install it on your network. It's something housed by Google. Software as a service is commercial software too. All these rules apply there just as well. Only you can't get your hands on your own data with software as a service. It all exists in some server somewhere that you can't put your hands on. And it can all go away at any moment without any warning or recourse. All your data, poof, gone. Maybe they didn't make any backups. And this happens. If you're wondering, like, what? A big vendor not make any backups? Oh, yes. Maybe power got cut to the building and then there was a fire. Maybe they just went out of business. I mean, these things happen every day to software as a service vendors. So be even more paranoid about software as a service. And then finally, team up. Like if you've got dozens of environmental health agencies within a state all signing their own separate contracts, don't do that. Like, just work together. There's unionize basically. By working together and collectively bargaining, you're going to be able to get a better rate, perhaps a strikingly better rate, and be able to negotiate collectively on features and timeline and so on. So team up. But the theme of all of that is you can't outsource your mission. That if your mission fails because your vendor fails, something's gone wrong. And a bunch of that comes down to where's your data? Can you put your hands on it? And if the vendor goes away, do you still have it? Don't outsource your mission. Remember those 2 million programmers? Same for these software developers that you hire or the vendors of the software. What they do is ubiquitous. What you know is rare. Don't overvalue what they can do for you. So my third and final thesis is this around efficiencies of scale. You should consider building your own software. I mean, I'm just pointing at any one of you, you probably should be building your own software. For any one health district or municipality to build their own software is probably a bad idea, mostly for lack of resources. Even if you could get the resources, say it's Los Angeles or New York City or Chicago, like even if you did have the resources to build your own system in a big municipality like that, the trick then is then maintaining it. That it's like getting a puppy. Like the cost isn't the cost of adopting the puppy, the cost is taking care of it for the rest of its life. So what you wind up with is building a system, and then people with the political will to make that happen, they don't have enough will to pay to keep it maintained. And then eventually you have a system that no longer meets your needs and it's just bad. Don't do that to yourself. At least with commercial software, hopefully the vendor will continue to improve it and will keep getting better. But if you build your own software without the ability to maintain it, as it's doubtful that many of you as organizations do, then you just have a system that isn't very good after a while. However, you should probably be collectively building your own software. And this is a thing, this is very much a thing. There are somewhere between dozens and maybe hundreds, we're still working on surveying this, of software co-ops throughout the United States who exist to do exactly this. So I'll give you an example. This is just a screenshot of Georgia's WinGap computer-aided mass appraisal system. Computer-aided mass appraisal system, often just called a CAMA. It's just to track taxable property. So like in Georgia, as in the rest of the country, localities need to keep track of boats and cars and houses and things like this. Who owns them? How long have they had it? What's it appraised at? What defense do they have for that appraisal? So they have to have systems to track these things. So in Georgia, they figured out in the late 1980s that they needed to computerize this system. And so some counties teamed up, and in 1989, they released this DOS-based software back then for a half dozen counties, and it has grown. At this point, all but 10 Georgia counties, so 149 counties, all use WIMGAP CAMA. And because so many counties are participating, it costs each of those localities $1,500 a year. That's it, because they all pool their money to hire software developers who work for a nonprofit that these counties have established. And the State Department of Taxation provides a help desk, their existing IT help desk service. They extend that to also provide help for this. But this is not unusual. There's Evergreen, the state of Georgia, their integrated library system, like tracking books and who checks them out and so on. They built that in Georgia, rolled it across the state of Georgia. It was so popular, it's now used in over 1,800 libraries around the world, including a bunch of co-ops that exist in different states to host it as software as a service, but as a nonprofit co-op model for their members. I love this one, Notify. Notify is created by the UK, realizing that many governments throughout the United Kingdom needed to send text messages, they needed to send emails, they needed to send postcards and letters, and they all had to procure their own contracts with their own vendors to be able to send these things. So the UK got one contract for each of these, and set up a single service where it's trivial for these agencies to say, send a text message that says these words to this phone number, go. And it's just sent, and they don't need to worry about it. All that is handled by this Notify system. That software has since been replicated by Australia and Canada, who are rolling those out nationwide as well. They're saving a fortune. This sort of approach does everybody a lot of good. So building your own software can be much cheaper. And by doing so, nobody can take away the software or really what we care about, your data. You are the masters of your future at this point. And it can have whatever features you want. Like whatever you want it to do, you and the members who use the software can make sure that it does that thing. So there's why. Let's talk about the how, which is tricky. So the good news is, like, this is a well-trod path. This is what we study, promote, and facilitate at the State Software Collaborative at Georgetown. But the process is pretty straightforward. Like, you got to team up, you got to figure out how to pool your funding and set up a governance model and start building your own system, or paying a vendor to do so. You can collaborate within states, which is a natural way to do it. To say, all right, in the state of Georgia, to go back to WIMGAP CAMA, there's a good example to draw on. Environmental health agencies throughout Georgia localities could say, all right, we're going to team up in Georgia. Or you could say, no, forget about a state-based thing. We know that these big cities have similar needs, or those of y'all who are in rural areas could say we have similar needs, where septic is a big deal here, but it's not a big deal in cities. So we're going to collaborate along those lines. You figure out what works for you. And there are hundreds of capable software development vendors do the development work. It is a really competitive space. This does not require extraordinary skills. You don't need somebody who's built environmental health systems before. You just need people who will listen to you and do the work as is clearly made necessary by talking to actual employees of your agencies who can describe their needs. And then you got to create some kind of a sustainable revenue stream for help desk and those updates. Remember, taking care of that puppy. That might be membership dues. There are different models available, but I think membership dues are a good one. And the cool thing here is, like, the more people you get, the cheaper it is. So, speaking of that, so like, let's do the math. Like, how much would this actually cost for some of y'all to team up? So good rule of thumb is what's known as a Scrum team. It's just a software development methodology. A Scrum team of developers, which is 4 to 9, runs about $1 million a year. And then once the software is done, the team size can be cut in half. My guess is, for $1 million in development costs, you can probably get something that does a whole bunch of what you need, and then it drops down to $500,000 in annual maintenance. I'm happy to actually work with any of y'all to talk about the specifics of what you need to get something a little better than this, like, rough guess. But you're probably looking at something like that. And then the more of you that team up, of course, like, the cheaper that this gets. And there are grants. There are grants from foundations, there are state-level grant programs and federal grant programs that could bring your cost way down. The trick, in fact, if this was only $1 million, is federal grantors at agencies being like, $1 million, that's not even worth our time. But get more states involved, make it more expensive. I don't know, but it might seem expensive to y'all, but just appreciate that, particularly from a federal, even a state grant perspective, that's really cheap. So I want to recap here on the things to do. I want you to insist on a data rights clause in all software contracts. If the vendor presents you with a contract and says, I need you to sign this, you get to push back because it's your government. I wouldn't give any room to flex on a data rights clause. You got to own your data. Like there's just no getting around it. The second is I want you to require and verify that the commercial software you get publishes public data openly. That is your insurance contract. You know, that's how you know that you can really get it. It's not something that is exercised as like a in case of ending contract break class. It's the ability to verify at all times that you can get the data out because other people are getting the data out. Number three, I want you to verify that the commercial software lets you export all of your data. So there's the public data, but you also need to have that like in case of emergency break glass thing. But you should be able to try it out anytime. Like it shouldn't be a threatening conversation to have with a vendor to say, hey, we want to test getting your data out. Like if that freaks them out or you'd be nervous making that request, like that's a sign of an unhealthy setup. There should be a button you can push at any time to get your data out. Google, by the way, for 10 years, Google has had this project called Google Takeout, where they want to make it as easy as possible for anybody to be able to take all their data out of Google. All your calendar events out of Google Calendar, your docs out of Google Docs, all of your email out of Gmail. Like they want to make it trivial to pull all that stuff out. It's a way for them to signal that they're not being anti-competitive, but also like it's a pretty healthy thing to do. So this isn't a weird thing to request. This is really normal at this point. Number four, I want you to verify vendors' claims. It's not enough for them to say, oh yeah, our software does that. You got to check, try it out, ask for a demo. And then fifth thing, build your software collaboratively. If you're gonna build software, if you have built software and you already have it and you're thinking, geez, our software's not so good anymore. Yeah, you got to maintain it. And the reason it's too much work to maintain is probably because you're trying to do it yourself. So team up, work together, protect your data. It's your most important asset. And now is the part where we talk and ask questions. And here's my email address up. And in case any of y'all want to ask me questions, back channel or at whatever future time is convenient for you.
Thanks so much, Waldo. That was great. And I know that there's going to be a lot of kind of ahas that folks in our community are having thanks to the content and the knowledge that you've shared here today. We're going to get into Q&A soon with our live audience. But before we do, I wanted to ask you a couple quick questions
Sure.
for clarification. So I really love this like team up idea. And, you know, maybe it's because I've been raised in the Pacific Northwest and my father was a fan of Costco, that I have learned from an early age the value of buying in bulk.
I like that.
He used to say better living through Costco. So, you know, I think this is kind of a new concept for folks to think about, oh, I could be joining with other governments in my region or other governments or other agencies that I feel are kind of mission and values aligned with ours. And so, you know, how do they start that conversation if they're interested in teaming up with another environmental health agency that they see as a good team member?
So you could definitely contact us at the State Software Collaborative. We are grant funded. We're not going to ask any money of you. You can say like, hey, we're going to team up. Help. How do we do that? We'll help you figure out how to do that. Literally our job to help with that. So we begin there. A second thing to do is to look for any existing collaboratives within your state that are already sharing software. And the low-hanging fruit there is, as I mentioned, Evergreen, the library software. If you just search for like Evergreen Libraries, ILS, that's the acronym for an integrated library system, Evergreen, ILS, and then the name of your state, you are likely to find that your state already has a software collaborative. So the reason it's important is because the hard part here is governance. Like who's in charge and who pays what and what does the board look like? And so finding these existing organizations to be able to pattern yourself on within a state is really helpful because they've already done the hard work. And it's best I can tell because it's so widely used. Evergreen is the most likely to exist within any given state to do this. States have processes set up for set up for establishing these different ways for localities to team up, and every state has their own approach. Sometimes requires an act of the legislature, which is terrible. Often it doesn't. They're not meant for software, but there's no reason why they can't be used for software. There's different ways that localities might team up for revenue sharing, or collaboratively having something like a shared mental health court, or I'm trying to remember some of the other things I've seen. But
I've
anyway,
actually
use
a great
those.
example.
Oh,
Sorry
great.
to talk over you. I've
No,
actually seen a
please.
great example out of California where, required by law, fire departments have to replace their fire trucks, I believe, every decade. And I learned from a fire marshal himself that essentially in order to save money, what would happen is the smaller jurisdictions piggyback on the contracts for fire trucks that LA County and other large municipalities write. And they get a big discount because they're buying fire trucks in bulk instead of buying one fire truck every
That's
10 years.
great.
And what's also cool about that is that they save so much that each of these small jurisdictions is oftentimes able to maintain at least one more FTE fireman on the books because they save that much on their fire truck every 10 years. So
I'll be telling that story. That's really cool.
I'm glad to share it then. The other question I have for you is, there may have been some folks who are watching today who have kind of an inkling that, oh, I might have some software that I'm on contract with that that may not be providing me the data I need, or I may be challenged in being able to open up my data because of this kind of legacy technology that we have. And what are some of the start points for that internal conversation? You mentioned reaching out to the vendor and just testing if you can get your data in a machine readable format, but who are some of the internal stakeholders who come together as part of this conversation once you realize, oops, we may not have access to our own data?
Lead with your procurement officer. Like that, everything starts with a procurement officer or the contracting officer, because that's the person who's going to know as soon as you're concerned about this. There may also be a CIO who'd like to be looped in as well. It seems to me like discovering like, oh wow, there are no airbags in my car. They don't work. They might have never been installed. Like a good solution is not to hope you don't get in a crash. You got to deal with that, and the sooner you deal with it, the better. If you're in a stronger negotiating relationship like those larger municipalities with a fire truck purchasing, you might be in a position to go to the vendor and retroactively say, we're going to need this. I'm going to need you to go ahead and add that, and you might get away with it. But if you're one of the smaller downstream towns getting the benefit from the fire truck contract, you are probably in no position to bargain with your vendor, in which case it might be time to look for a new car. Because like it's only, I got cars, I got fire trucks. This is a heck of a metaphor. It's only going to get worse as you put more data in a system that you can't get out. So the sooner that you can address that head on and figure out what to do about it, the better. Because otherwise, worst case, that vendor goes out of business and y'all show up to work some Monday morning and you have nothing.
And I have personally seen that as an advisor to governments, where they actually lost access to their data. And it's a pretty scary and vulnerable feeling situation to be in. So I think a lot of what you've shared today is going to be pretty empowering and put more environmental health agencies in the driver's seat around managing, owning, being able to use and share their data in really profoundly useful ways. So I'm so glad you could join us, Waldo. Madeline here is also with NEHA. Thank you, Madeline, for your time today in managing this webinar. And we will be coming up on our third webinar with Sasha Anderson from USA Facts. She's going to be sharing with us how USA Facts, as a third-party independent organization, uses open data from across the United States to provide citizens and government and even federal agencies really useful insights into what's actively happening across the United States. And all of that information is fueled by open data. So I hope you will join us for that next webinar. Thank you again, Waldo. You can find more of Waldo's work at the Beck Center's website. And looking forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thanks so much.
And we're gonna throw a survey up for all of you to take. It's just a few questions, and we'll have it up on screen while. Thank you, Maddie, for getting that poll going for us. And so we encourage you all to answer those questions. We're also going to take more questions from the audience. I'm excited to see a few come in. And if you have any more questions, we've got a good bit of time here. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. You can also drop them in the chat. I would just be mindful of selecting all panelists and attendees on the to line in the chat. We've had some questions that are coming through just to panelists, and you may want to get more response from your fellow attendees as well. So I want to, now that we've called out the post-evaluation poll, I want to go into a question that we saw in the chat that is from, sorry, I'm just taking a look here. Andrew Harrison. Thanks, Andrew, for your question. Waldo, his question is, regarding agencies building their own software, why isn't this done more often? What are pitfalls that past projects of this nature have run into? I think that's a great question.
Yeah, I think anybody should be wicked suspicious when somebody says like, hey, here's a really easy thing everybody should do. Okay, why isn't everybody doing it? So a couple things. The first is, just to undercut what I was saying, like wicked easy. Like, no, this is all hard. Everything we're talking about here is really hard. So the two biggest reasons I see this isn't done more often. The first, and why some of these have gone wrong. The first is that getting anything in government is conflated with procurement. So if you need some new technical functionality, not a process before procurement to say, hey, so does this exist? Like, do we have any peer organizations that maybe own something they built themselves that we could share or get a copy of? Like, that's not part of the process. Instead, the process is it goes directly to procurement. You might issue an RFI, and other states, health agencies, health departments are going to get back to you and say, hey, I wanted to respond to your RFI formally to tell you, you don't need to do this. Like for RFIs, you only hear from companies that hope to get your business. Like that's the idea. And there aren't companies that bid to say, hey, don't hire us. This thing already exists. Like, and then RFI naturally leads to an RFP or an RFQ in which you get the proposals from vendors saying, yes, we will perform the service that you need for, X dollars a year or whatever. So there's not really a process in there, or there's no step in that process to say, well, actually, let's consider whether this is something that we should build ourselves or just share with somebody else who's already built it. So that's one really significant obstacle. What can kill these projects? They live or die on governance. I saw there are these consortiums that have been set up for unemployment insurance, just a few of them, where states try to share unemployment insurance systems, and they've gone really terribly. They've all gone horribly. And the biggest reason they've gone really badly is because there seems to have been very little thought around governance. And a great example of this is I was reading a letter written, I think it was earlier this year, by a top person for the Vermont Employment Agency, explaining why they pulled out of one of these consortiums. So it turns out that Idaho was one of the other two states with them in this consortium. It was a three-state consortium. Idaho developed the software like just for Idaho's needs without even consulting Vermont. And when they were done, like, all right, here, Vermont, here you go, you can use our software. And Vermont said like, well, this doesn't actually meet our needs perfectly. Just give us the source code and we'll modify it. And Idaho said, no, we don't want to give you the source code. Vermont had to say, I don't understand. This is like a take it or leave it situation. You didn't consult us on what our needs were. We need some changes to the software and you won't let us make the changes. And Idaho was like, yeah, that's about right. So Vermont pulled out. I think the other state pulled out too. What I don't understand is how they even got started in the first place without hammering out the question of like, all right, how do we know what we're going to build and whose needs we're trying to satisfy here? So when we see problems with these systems, where people try to set up these sort of co-ops and they don't work. The biggest problem that we see is governance. Another big obstacle is this is what's happening to these state UI consortiums, is they try to build this software in an old-fashioned way where instead of one state issuing an RFP, never consulting any end users about what their needs are. Like they don't do that at all. Instead, they just issue an RFP and they award a contract to a vendor to build something custom for them. But they try to do it for like 3 states at once, where they define all the requirements up front, and the vendor goes away for a few years and comes back and says, hey, we're done, here's your software. And like, it's never what they needed. It's always late. It's always over budget. So now instead of doing that for one state, they're using that busted old process for multiple states at once. Like, don't do that. Find out what users need. Find out what like actual employees of environmental health associations need and build that thing for them. And like iteratively deliver it. So every couple of weeks, you're getting better functionality as a department or as an agency. And it keeps improving. That's the way to do this. That's how people build software in this particular millennium. But a lot of government hasn't caught up. So that's another reason why these things don't go well, is because a lot of software projects just don't go well if you use the way that the government generally continues to build software. The private sector long ago figure out how to do this. And as mentioned in my introduction, I just spent 4 years with 18F. It's the government technology department. It's so named because it's the intersection of 18th and F Street. But the way 18F builds software and teaches government to build software, you can go to the website at 18f.gov if you want to learn about more about that. We know how to build software in ways that these things won't fail. So you combine like grown-up software development methodologies with just planning the governance up front of like what it actually looks like to collaborate, and the success rate of these things just skyrockets. So that's why this isn't done more often, is it's not a part of that procurement process. And when it happens and it fails, it's almost always because of just nobody planned up front what the governance is going to look like.
Thank you, Waldo. One other question we have is from Bob, and we might need a little clarification, Bob, from you in the chat. So
he just provided a little bit to me.
Oh, excellent! Thank you. I will check that here. So it sounds like he's concerned about like this sounds great, but kind of getting things moving before they buy something can be expensive. There's concern around not meeting their needs. I think you also talked about, kind of hinted at just now in your last answer, Waldo, of like this question of scoping before you go in.
Yeah.
Whether you're buying a piece of, you're going through a traditional vendor and going that route to meet your agency's needs, or you're looking at a more collaborative model. It sounds like you have some real thoughts around scoping prior to getting in, prior to putting money on the table. Can you describe a couple of best practices for scoping prior to this?
Yeah, I bought a new car a little over a year ago. I got a Chevy Bolt, an electric car, which, like, by the way, I love. It turns out electric cars require almost literally no maintenance. They gave me the maintenance schedule. I'm not kidding, on a Post-it note. And I was like, what is this? They're like, oh, that's the 3 things you ever have to maintain on this car. It's amazing. But when I went in to buy it, I'd never bought a new car in my life. And I went in with one thing in mind. And the thing about that process, as any of y'all have bought a car know, is you might go in thinking, look, I want something that gets at least these many miles per gallon and that like seats these many people, and that's it. But then like 10 minutes later, they're like, well, if you don't get the rust undercoating, oh no, I have to get the rust undercoating. And of course you want the cup holders in the back seat and the USB chargers, and you got to get the sunroof. Well, yeah, I've got to get the sunroof. Like it's easy to get scope creep, that like the thing you originally intended to get, you wind up deciding to get a bunch of more stuff in the process. It is really helpful to figure out up front exactly what you need. And this isn't just software, this is true for everything. So, here's Waldo's life advice. I'm applying it to software here, of course, that you want to figure out what you need up front and then stick to that. Because if you're going to get something that is more complicated, that comes with a bunch more maintenance costs and overhead. I think of Microsoft Word. So the thing about Microsoft Word is it's really complicated. I don't know about you, but I and most people I know only ever use like 10% of the functionality of Microsoft Word. because it does a lot. And so when I need to use that 10%, it's hard to find because there's all this weird stuff in there that Microsoft put in there because some really big customer like the US government said, you got to have this functionality. So they put it in for everybody. There is cognitive overhead associated with that. There's training overhead associated with that. And then if it's something that's bigger and more complicated than Word, something that lives on a bunch of servers, there's infrastructure that's associated with that. And you're paying ultimately costs for things you don't need. So I really encourage you to figure out upfront exactly what functionality you need and hew as closely to that as you can. Instead of providing some really vague needs upfront of like, well, we need a system for environmental health. Nah, it's your punch list. We need users to be able to do this and to do that. It's ideally in the form of defining user needs. This is usually done in software development by saying, as a blank, I need to blank so I can blank. Too many blanks. Let me spell one out. It might be, as a frontline state user of the system, I want to be able to look at the entire history for a single record so that I can perform longitudinal analysis. So you might collect a few dozen of those things of like what the user needs are, and you include those in your RFP. Look, here's the stuff that we need. And then you can evaluate the proposals on the basis of not who's going to give you the rust undercoating and the sunroof, but who just does the things you need. And if it turns out nobody does what you need, well, either you got to change your needs or maybe consider paying software developers to build something for you, or better, of course, teaming up with some other vendors. But yeah, be wary of the system with all the bells and whistles, because they're charging for bells and whistles, and you'll have to maintain them. I hope I got to your. I hope I got across the thrust of what you had in mind there, Bob. Thanks
for that, Waldo. And as someone else who's recently purchased a car, yes, I know that experience, and it does resonate with the software buying experience too.
The thing is, I went in determined not to do that. I was like, I'm not going to be one of those people. And went in and said like, oh my God, I'm one of those people.
I had a little of that too. So I was wondering, we had a comment come in from an anonymous attendee where they said, make sure to get your IT department involved, because if they won't support it, it's almost a waste to get it.
Dear God, yes. Yes.
And sorry, I'm just going to clarify. Like I've seen where sometimes it is, excuse me, sometimes a government has held on to a particular piece of software or tool for so long that much of the career of someone in your IT department is heavily dependent on being an expert in essentially what is a legacy tool. And so when you try to bring them a new thing or a new idea or a vendor tool, it's almost immediately concerning, because they're thinking in terms of the transitioning that they're going to have to do and the new learning curve with this. So one, I think it's good to get to the point of what our attendee is kind of pointing at here in terms of IT department engagement. And two, I'm kind of wondering if you run into hiccups with that engagement, what are some strategies for addressing concerns or working with your IT team on what is essentially new and a little scary?
So I routinely see IT teams at all levels of government treated as end of pipe processes. And I worked years ago, I worked in IT for the state of Virginia early in my career. And more than once, somebody way above my head went ahead and procured some system and said, all right, we published the RFP, we selected the vendor, here, implement this thing. And I'd be left saying, what? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't solve the need it's supposed to. That doesn't work on our infrastructure. We're going to have to get entirely new servers and switch to operating system. Why did you do this? It's a huge, really common mistake not to do the opposite of that, which is begin with the IT team and with some relevant people within the IT team who maybe have experience or can rapidly get the experience or knowledge, know how to engage on a new project, and include them in the process of writing the RFP, of evaluating the responses. Put them on the vendor evaluation team for evaluating those responses, so that you're not just dropping something in their lap that they may be bitter that they have to deal with, but instead they're part of the process of choosing it because they're the ones who are going to have to live with that system. And finding out, not just like early on, but throughout the whole process, finding out from them iteratively, this works better, this works worse, this makes sense given our team's experience, this does not, is going to be a big help. I saw one client at 18F a couple years ago. They were AWS users, and at the last minute, they decided to award an RFP without consulting their, Amazon Web Services, the cloud hosting environment, is what this agency used. And they were awarding a new contract for some new software. And at the last day, they decided on a different vendor than they previously settled on that was proposing a solution using Microsoft Azure. And I had to look at the faces of this IT team saying, like, we don't know anything about that. We can't possibly implement that. We all have lots of expertise in AWS that does not really port to Azure. This is a terrible decision. And it set them back months. And it was part of why we wound up pulling out of being involved in that particular engagement, because it was such a mess at that point. But that's what happens when you don't consult your IT team, not just like, hey, can you support this? But you want them to be vigorous, enthusiastic participants in the whole process, because the success of this effort is probably going to live or die on how they do in helping to execute it.
Thank you. We have a great question from Chow Lin, who asks, how often do you recommend to evaluate your third-party vendors and send out RFPs to possibly replace them?
I can't give you a number because it depends so much on what they're doing for you and how much you're spending on it, how ubiquitous that service is. I will say that the existing process for doing this in government, generally speaking, is busted. And that process is the pervasive belief in government that I left government a few months ago. I got to stop saying we. It was just, I worked for state and federal government for a long time. The people in government employees can't know anything about technology or really anything that the private sector does. And the only way to know anything is you publish a request for information. Like, hey, we're looking at doing something with cloud hosting, but like we can't use Google, I guess. So, hey, vendors, tell us anything we need to know about cloud hosting and responses to this RFI. And it's such a pain to issue an RFI and deal with the responses, and it all has to go through procurement office to do that people want to do that as rarely as possible. So it becomes this incentive to know as little as possible because it's a pain to learn new things, as opposed to just saying, hey, it needs to be somebody's job, and it could be the contract officer's representative, it could be somebody in the IT office, it could be any of y'all, to just be aware of one or more of the systems that you rely on, and keep an eye on that space. Research new vendors occasionally. And above all, as I mentioned earlier, talk to your peers at gatherings like this to find out what they're using and how they like it. Because I mean, even like it's my job to keep up with this stuff, and I'm routinely discovering great new functionality in vendors that I thought that I knew well, but I was actually out of touch by 6 months, and things got better and I didn't know it. So I encourage moving from a model where you have to issue RFIs or RFPs to learn new things to instead a model of continuous awareness of what other possibilities exist. And only when you discover that you have a need that wasn't being met, and there's a way to meet that need now with new functionality exists. So like not the sunroof, unless it turns out you really need a sunroof, not the rust undercoating, but something you really need that now exists out there in the marketplace. That is when you might consider recompeting something that exists, but or an existing contract, but only when those circumstances are met. And through that continuous learning, I think is a much better way to do that than the RFI RFP model.
That's really constructive and helpful. Thanks, Waldo. I don't want to miss anybody's question. We've got a couple minutes left, and I know we've presented a lot of new information here. So I want to shout out a couple of things. One, if you have some questions after this webinar, it's not too late to ask them. Please feel free to tweet at Waldo. Waldo, can you drop your Twitter handle into the chat for us?
Such a long, yes.
And you can also CC me on that too. And then if you haven't taken our poll yet and you've kind of cleared that little poll window, on the bottom center of your Zoom screen, you'll see a button for polling. Just click that, fill out our few questions. We'd sure appreciate it. Really helps us. And so if there aren't any other questions, I had one come up for me where I was kind of wondering, you know, when you were talking about some of the budget numbers for collaborative software projects, Waldo, you threw out a number of like perhaps $1 million for the first year and $500,000 for every year after. And those numbers...
Super rough guess. Yeah.
Those numbers could feel reasonable if you're at a federal agency or at a state. They might feel way out of reach and huge and impossible if you are in a local government agency or a county government, right? So, you know, I'm wondering, okay, if someone is inspired by this talk and wants to start exploring this work, one, what are some resources available to them? And two, you know, how big should they be trying to set a goal of making a team of other governments who would collaborate with them? You know, they got to split up this cost somehow. So how many folks should they be bringing in? Thanks.
I'd say it depends on the size of the other municipalities you'd be working with. Whenever possible, and politics vary a lot between states, but whenever possible, if you can work with the relevant state agency as the coordinating actor there, it's really helpful. If you need to get, I mean, like in the case of the Georgia example I gave you all those counties that team up, those 129 counties, they're the most rural counties in Georgia. The 10 that aren't part of that consortium are Atlanta and immediately around it. They were able to get critical mass with, I think it was like 6 counties or something, maybe 10, I forget, that they started with. It didn't take a whole lot. And while you might have to spend $1 million to get things off the ground, my guess is it depends on how complicated your needs are. It's possible you can do it for a whole lot less. But if you're a small municipality, see if you can find a much bigger one to team up with, because just them and you might be enough to get that started if you're working with, you know, a city of millions of people. And otherwise, you have to get some critical mass in which there's enough financial contributions that every member can make that you have enough money to be able to fund that team, which again, $1 million is a shorthand. Could be as little as $500,000, could be as much as $2 million a year for that development team. But you need a critical mass of funders, which often means a critical mass of population in the represented areas.
Thanks, Waldo. We had a question from Samantha that was more towards the environmental health attendees around what other states are using vendors, or what vendors they're using. So I encourage you attendees to answer in chat. But I can say that from an assessment perspective, Samantha, at NEHA, on the aquatic facility data program that I've been a part of, we completed a ecosystem scan of, I think we took a look at over 1,000 environmental health agencies in the United States and got to about 919 that were officially in our ecosystem scan, and then broke down a number of factors that we were seeing with these environmental health agencies, and found about 6 to 7 major vendors that were supplying this sample of 919 environmental health agencies. One interesting thing I would say, kind of more anecdotally, was when we interviewed several dozen of these governments and then had less formal conversations with other governments at the last AEC we had in 2019, July 2019, I found that approximately 40% of environmental health agencies were currently in the process of moving to a new type of environmental health inspection software or database tool, or we're considering that move in the next 2 years. So I think that this is a particularly timely webinar for all of us, as it seems like there is a bit of a shift, and thinking about what are folks going to be using in the future, and are their current tools meeting their needs? So thank you for that point and question to the group. So we're right at 11:02. If you haven't finished your poll, please do. I want to thank our speaker, Waldo Jaquith, for a great talk, and for all of you for participating. Good news is this webinar, like all of the webinars in our series, will be online through NEHA's website. You can look at Twitter and NEHA's website for the links to this. We'll probably have this session up in a couple of days. And we're intending this webinar to be an ongoing resource that lives on NEHA's website. And next week, same time, same place, we will have our presentation on third-party data use in environmental health with Sasha Anderson of USAFACTS. You may have seen USAFACTS promoted quite a bit recently. We're excited to have them with us next week. And that is it from here. Maddie, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we're all great, all good. I'm so grateful for Waldo for joining us today, and Sarah for your moderating and whatnot. So like she said, stay tuned for the other webinars coming up. There's 2 more left. And please let me know if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.